At this point, I've been traveling for about 3 weeks. I know it sounds strange because it's taken years to edit and come out with this season.
It's a little bit of everything. The season will start on December 15.
On this trip, I only have a few days left before it's back to work, and it looks like I'm in the home stretch. My last destination before home is, believe it or not, actually in Wisconsin. A close friend of mine is getting married and we're going to his cabin to have a bachelor party of sorts. To get to Wisconsin, I need to cross over the northern halves of 2 states, North Dakota and my home state of Minnesota. I'm getting really close to the end. North Dakota is going to prove to be an exhausting haul. It's about 330 miles down US Route 2 to the Minnesota border, but I'm going to make a bit of a detour. I'm adding another 100 miles or an hour and a half to the ride today. I also believe I'm doing it for a good reason. You see, you may not know this about me, but another hobby of mine other than this channel is collecting license plates. Ever since I was about 4 years old, and a neighbor who moved in from out of state gave me a South Dakota plate, I'd been obsessed with finding more. I've never purchased any online. Each one has a bit of a story. My North Dakota plate has always been on display somewhere with the words Peace Garden State on it. Every state in the Union has its own claim. The Empire State, the Sunshine State. I've wondered why North Dakota would claim this particular peace garden as its namesake. I figure I might as well check it out because it's along the way and there's little chance I'll go out of my way to see it on another trip. It's smack dab in the middle of nowhere on the northern border away from any major locales. I'm kind of asking for a bad time though. I'm choosing to add another 100 miles on this ride and it actually looks like it's going to rain. I've been extremely fortunate on this trip so far when it comes to weather. I figure this is as good a time as any to keep diving into North Dakota's past. In other states in this season, we've taken a look at Native American history, current events, Wild West history, but there's one particular time in history that really fascinates me: the Progressive Era. To put it on a timeline, we have to start with the US Civil War. After that war, the US really started expanding westward and embracing the Industrial Revolution. It's hard to paint the same time period across the world. Out west, there was the Indian Wars and the Manifest Destiny era. In England, it was known as the Victorian era when the British Empire was at its peak. And in the Deep South, they called it the Reconstruction era. For the northeastern, older Yankee half of the US that won the Civil War, it was in what was called the Gilded Age, a name coined by Mark Twain, a huge critic of the era. The Gilded Age was a time in US history where the Industrial Revolution really took off, but the common man, such as a farmer, laborer, or dock worker, had very few rights. It was a time where workers' rights were basically non-existent. No holidays, no minimum wage, child labor, no safety regulations, and corruption was at its peak. The most wealthy heads of industry, unaffectionately known as robber barons, bought politicians by the handful and their industries had very little regulation. The market was ruled by these monopoly trusts. I imagine it was a tough time for the majority of working-class Americans in the East, and I can see why many of them would want to populate the American frontier, where life was more simple and free from the dominating forces of the titans of industry. North Dakota was right on the border of this east-west frontier divide, and it was no exception. Because the state was so young compared to its older and more established neighbor Minnesota, it was more than just an uphill battle against the industry of the Twin Cities. The population of North Dakota had to pretty much bow to the will of the industrial metro area. Eastern corporations would buy up huge plots of land that white settlers would work. Remember the Northern Pacific Railway? That railroad that Sitting Bull fought against? The very same railroad that the Washington Territorial Governor Isaac Stevens fought so hard for that ended up turning the Pacific Northwest into a warring hellscape? The one that turned Seattle into a serious major city? It was headquartered in St. Paul, Minnesota. If the farmers in North Dakota wanted to ship their products out to the rest of the country and the world, they had to answer to St. Paul. Many politicians that represented North Dakota still answered to St. Paul first. If North Dakotans wanted anything shipped to them to help build their state, they would have to answer to Minnesota first. This was the North Dakota of the Gilded Age. Eventually, this era of deregulated industry started to give way around the turn of the century. A new generation, born out of the Gilded Age, would begin to fight for a better life. For safety regulations, holidays, women's voting rights, bargaining and union rights, weekends, overtime pay, trust busting, or monopoly breaking and wage raises. The Industrial Revolution and free market had trampled the previous generation, but no more. From the 1890s until about the 1920s, the US would enter the Progressive Era. North Dakota was in the perfect position to rebel against its Minnesotan corporate overlords. North Dakota was ripe for a socialist revolution.